Hello, my friends, and thanks for stopping by. This is the Chad Neighbors, and in this video, I want to talk to you about painting your BattleTech miniatures. BattleTech elicits more of a historical wargame vibe concerning its lore compared to many other sci-fi games. Hardcore players are much of the time highly knowledgeable and very serious about the many different eras and factions in the lore, and the expectation of lore correctness may create significant pressure on new players to make the right choice concerning their paint job if they want to fit in with the group or the wider player base. It is apparent that new Battletech players, or I should say players new to the IP, have to overcome not only their own indecision at making a choice, but also era anxiety, and in some cases, the approval of their fellow players, be that approval real or imagined. Over and over again through the years, in Facebook groups, on Discord, and during in-person conversations, I've heard these questions from new players, or a variation thereof. How do I pick a faction? And what's the correct way to paint my models? Today, I'm addressing this question for posterity. Now, for you viewers that are new to tabletop wargaming generally and new to BattleTech specifically, if you've ever asked this question of yourself or someone else, you've landed on the right video. You seasoned vets and pros, this video will be less helpful, but I hope you'll stick around anyway. I'll be showing off some of my collection throughout, and at the very least, you can pass this video on to someone in your travels that may make use of it. So, why is this consternation over picking a paint job a big deal? Is this actually a problem? It is, says I, and here's why. BattleTech doesn't have good onboarding for new players at all. The primer doc that players get in the box sets don't even scratch the surface of what they need to know to make an informed choice for painting their guys. Let's unpack all of this. Simple indecision, you don't need me to explain that. We've all been there. Era anxiety is my term, one I just made up, that codifies what new players feel when trying to navigate the complexity of BattleTech's many different eras. For those not already in the know, the in-universe setting technically stretches from the turn of the 2000s all the way to the mid-3100s. In order, the eras are Age of War, Star League, Early Succession Wars, Late Succession Wars, with Late Succession Wars being split into the Lost Tech and Renaissance eras. Then there's the Clan Invasion, the Federated Commonwealth Civil War, the Word of Blade Jihad, the Early Republic, the Late Republic, Dark Age, and finally, the current era, the Ill Clan era. Each era has factions that appear or disappear, units that persist, change, or are annihilated to the last man. Good grief. This is awesome stuff for fans, for the serious lore hounds, but it is little wonder that new players struggle to understand how eras influence or constrain their choice of faction, and accordingly, how they should paint their models. As an example, do you want to go with solid red for your mechs? Can't go wrong with that. The iconic red faction in BattleTech is, of course, the Draconis Combine. So solid red it is. Nice. Now everyone will know you're a Drac player. Except they might mistake you for the Federated Sons, 3rd Robinson Rangers, which are also predominantly red. That's a little ironic, since most players associate Davion forces with green or blue, red and white, but it's also ironic because those cats hate, and I mean hate, their snake neighbors. Okay, bad example, you might say. Let's say instead you really like purple and white. Clean, classy. Here's a cool latter era unit with those colors from the Free Worlds League, the 7th Tamarind Regulars. But then again, those are the exact same colors worn by the ever-cursed Wilson's Hussars, a bedraggled, scrappy group of can't-do-right mercenaries barely clinging to existence. I can go on, but here we've landed on a big part of the problem. Picking any one color or pattern doesn't authoritatively indicate one faction or another when both factions can use the exact same mechs and other hardware. You can have 4 players at the table playing BattleTech, each with solid red minis, and each of them can represent an entirely unique faction. Who's on first? It's enough to send anyone into brainlock. Now, dear friends, marvel as I alienate half of my viewers and present my cutting-edge methodology for navigating the intricacies of painting your forces to the satisfaction of one and all. Ignore the lore. You veteran BT fans, please take your hands off those guns and hear me out. Folks, if you are read in on the lore and admire a faction or a particular unit, or maybe just ran across a paint scheme you like on camospecs.com, by all means, roll with it. Really, just go with it. That's my first point. You can sabotage yourself by getting too wrapped around the axle with era availability or the survival of a unit from one year to another and ladder reformation or whatever. Whether or not your chosen faction actually takes to the field in a bright, snazzy parade paint scheme or camouflage. Pick what you like and roll with it. Done. Also, take comfort knowing that many, many disparate units have identical or nearly identical paint schemes and spread across many different eras. If you are passionate about what you see is what you get, or WYSIWYG like I am, trust you'll always be able to plausibly count as your guys in different eras. For instance, these red mechs you've been seeing are easily mistaken for yet another standard Draconis Combine force, but they are actually the Band of the Damned, a group of nasty pirates and deserters from the DCMS. In purely game terms, though, they could take to the field as a sort of light regiment in a pinch. They're both red, the exact same red. Just be sure to ignore that flaming V insignia. So that's all fine and good for justification or workarounds if you insist on being passably lore adherent. But here's what I'd prefer to push uncertain players towards. Paint your guys however you want, in whatever way feels best to you, and then craft your own stories to fit them into a given era. The bottom line is you'll have more fun with the force of your own devising. Not for nothing. For all of the grander scope and details inherent to BattleTech, there is still so much room for you to tell your own stories in what I call the cracks. BattleTech's setting is incredibly rich, and the barely developed and alluded to parts are just as intriguing and just as interesting as the main published storylines. I like to think of them as stories waiting to be told. I'll bring this point home in a second, but right now do me a favor and click like and subscribe if you are enjoying the video so far and enjoying the content on my channel generally. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad you're here. So moving on, the obvious route to go if you want your force to be era and lore flexible is to make up yet another band of mercenaries. It stands to reason that untold numbers of hired guns from units great and small are active throughout the inner sphere and always have been, and they always will be. They might not be a footnote in the established lore, but for you and the guys playing with you, their exploits, victories, and defeats could be the stuff of legends. This approach opens the door to any conceivable color scheme you can think of, and as a reminder, many mercs in the setting use colors that are identical to, or close to, the colors of their patron nations. That's another consideration that can get you a little more mileage out of one painted force. Your merc band could stand in for a house force if you need to lend some minis to a buddy or you need an op for. If you want to go a little more generic, but a lot more versatile, just be small timers, good or bad. Paint up your models in any camouflage pattern you like, or even just use solid military drab colors. And you can easily say they're a planetary militia, they're bandits, pirates, corporate security, or a reserve unit for one of the big house militaries. This is one of my favorite approaches to keeping my models flexible for use in many different eras and with a high degree of verisimilitude. Olive drab, coyote brown, urban gray will always be in style for military endeavors. Also recall what I said a little while ago. Many major units ditch those distinctive, colorful parade paint jobs for environment-specific camo as a matter of course when operating in the field. Now, even if you're keeping your force store brand generic in appearance, thinking up a basic premise and a little foundational lore for them is still a worthwhile exercise because it gets you creating, not consuming something made by someone else. It's yet another avenue in the hobby that can bring you satisfaction, and it can be a rewarding pastime in its own right. And I'm not saying you have to go sharing that stuff online or anywhere else. Frankly, like most other wargamers out there, most BT players and fans just don't care about fan fiction unless it's exceptionally well done, and most of it isn't. But if your lore building does nothing but help frame a narrative and set the stakes for you and your fellow gamers at your table, that is a mission accomplished in my book. Simply stated, your dudes means your stories are being told, and that means a much richer gaming experience. But going with a unit and a paint scheme of your own devising brings up another set of questions. If you're not particularly creative, how do you decide you're back to square one? That's something you'll have to work through on your own. But I will share with you some methods that I use that always get my creative engine running. The first is to think of the setting around a conflict, a casus belli for the belligerents. By way of another, for instance, one of my very favorite forces I've ever cooked up, these gray and orange moon pirates, stemmed from my daydreaming about the board I talked out in my previous video, that deep space mining installation situated somewhere way out there on a huge asteroid or planetoid. Valuable commodities and a long, vulnerable logistics chain to ferry them back to civilization means that piracy is on the table. And so, how would pirates engaged in such pillaging look? I figured they'd be a flat, sort of deniable ops gray with a high-vis orange marker panels here and there so they could instantly, visually, sort out friend from foe during a raid. Another method I use for sparking inspiration is, simply enough, I find a paint scheme that I really like that's just appealing, and I start painting it, and I figure out the lore later. If we're being completely honest, sometimes you don't need lore to have a good time. Your friend has his forces, you've got yours. Now you both fight, and the dice will decide who's wrong or right. If you're completely jammed up and just cannot decide on anything, maybe you just can't narrow down from a selection of paint jobs you do really like, don't decide. Go with all of them. This is the flying circus route. There are particularly idiosyncratic units in the BattleTech universe that allow their fighters to paint their mechs or vehicles whatever color or pattern they desire. There's no uniform standard, or maybe, in some cases, a unit doesn't have the time, money, or inclination to paint their machines to make them match in terms of appearance. That's not even touching on a setting where you'd expect to see some really diverse paint schemes, like the gladiatorial stables of Solaris 7 and other game worlds, maybe an assemblage of independent gunslingers thrown together for a desperate job, things like that. The unifying factor in the end for your force might be that they simply aren't uniform. At the end of the day, here's what matters. You should paint your minis whatever color or pattern and have them belong to whatever faction or unit appeals to you. Just get them painted, and paint bravely. Then get out there and game with the people that you want to game with. That's all I've got to say on the matter for now. Everyone, thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure you hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and want more. And please swing down to the comments and drop some wisdom or tips that helped you decide on a paint scheme or faction in the past. Your comment might be the breakthrough someone needs to bust out of a hobby rut. Also, anyone who's interested in the Paint Roulette Invitational, link in the description, the info video with links to the sign-up form are coming this week before the weekend is out. Do stay tuned for that, and grab any of your friends you think would like to participate. I'll also have another Mech in a Minute video here going up in just a day or two. That's all I've got for you today. Thanks again for watching, and remember, have character, don't be a character, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good one.